Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
Good to see you.
Sure.
Wild meeting. I'm interested in your house stuff, but I want to share with the audience for a minute. You have a weird guy up here. I'm
Hey.
probably going to get in trouble from this, my team. You know, he
You have non-standard.
yeah, is non-standard. Before I get to the real juicy stuff that's relevant to today, I want to just tell two things about the way his mind works. He and his brother are basically theater lighting tycoons. Is that fair?
Oh, well,
You control the theater lighting business.
we're doing pretty well, yeah.
But applied microprocessors to lighting early in the stage of microprocessors and built this into theater lighting. He also worked at Fermi National Labs, and Fermi was a part of the team that discovered the heaviest quark, which is the heaviest matter that we have in the world. So you're a non-traditional congressman, right?
That's right. Well, I'm just another one of those congressmen who went from theatrical stage lighting to high-energy particle physics to the U.S. Congress. So
Right.
just another one
I
of them.
find this wonderful.
Yeah. Well,
and
actually, if I'm correct, actually, I think that the stage lighting used for this event right here is actually from our company. Aha, yes, confirmation.
this is like a flyover of the jets. Thank you for doing that. But to more serious things, you are. I was thinking about this today. You're the only PhD scientist in Congress today, and certainly the only PhD physicist in there. And so obviously, you have your stakes in science. I don't think he was not part of the U.S. Congress, perhaps during the Articles of Confederation, but you remind me of Ben Franklin, right? So Ben Franklin was a guy who brought science, applied issues, lighting to challenges around the world.
Sure.
So maybe you're the Ben Franklin of the day. But I guess,
well, in fact, when I was looking into an effort to actually expand the number of scientists in the U.S. Congress,
right,
we were thinking of setting up an organization that we were calling first Albert's List, like Emily's List for scientists. But it turns out that's not possible because of Albert Einstein sold his personality rights to a university that very aggressively pursues the intellectual property. So we switched over to Ben Franklin's list.
Oh, interesting. And has that worked?
Well, it is on hold. When I decided to return this, I looked into this after I lost my seat in the Tea Party wave, and when I decided to return to Congress afterwards, it's on hold, but it's still on my to-do list.
Well, terrific. Well, let me ask you just the question about the ecosystem. We're discussing Alzheimer's today, of course, but really there's a question of government investment in the kind of needed deficits out there, and one of them being Alzheimer's research. But broader than that, can you tell us what it's like working in Congress, in a serious way, with folks that don't have your science literacy, but you're trying to make the case for greater investment, which has been declining overall for quite a time?
China is about to pass the U.S. for total research investment. And so that's a very serious long-term threat. And one of the structural difficulties, I think, with any democracy is that all the political incentives are short-term. It's all about getting elected next cycle. This causes us to underinvest in a wide variety of things, like basic scientific research, like early childhood education. You can just go down a very long list. And I think the best way to handle that is, well, twofold. First, to very consciously support candidates and members that talk about the long-term best interests of our country and not just about the tweet of the day. And secondly is to make the economic case. For Alzheimer's, it's just blindingly clear. We're spending something like $200 billion per year for Alzheimer's, and that's going to be up near $1 trillion within a couple decades. And this is, if we could come up with a low-cost cure for either Alzheimer's or diabetes, that pretty much gets rid of the long-term stress on our healthcare budgets in the U.S., which are, of course, driving so much of the, the political tension, shall we say.
Have you looked at, as both a congressman but as a scientist, at something that's hard for some of us to do, which is to just sort of kick the tires of the science itself and the scientific speed bumps and blocks to success in this? We're talking about the need for more research, and we even have, I referenced earlier, a prize winner who said, look, we may have a breakthrough that can turn this into essentially a non-issue in 10 years. And I'm wondering whether or not you've looked at the scientific development of this, and does it track like cancer tracked or other areas where there have been major investments and we've seen such huge impacts? Do you feel the same is true with Alzheimer's?
Different diseases are different. Things like, I'll say, sickle cell disease.
Right.
We know exactly the genetic defect that causes that. And so that there's a very good chance that there will be a magic bullet for for sickle cell disease.
Mm.
Alzheimer's, we hoped maybe 10, 15 years ago that targeting either the tau or the tangles would actually be a magic bullet. It appears not to. If it's effective, it'll probably be in combination, like cancer therapies. My brother actually is got stage 4 esophageal cancer, and has after he got the tumor sequence, they found they had a targeted drug at the University of Chicago, and got rid of all the metastases. He's down to the primary tumor and about to start a different kind of immunotherapy. And so I actually gave a speech on the floor of the House several years ago, about right after immunotherapy for cancer got declared to be the breakthrough of the year by Science magazine. And it was actually based on a letter to the editor that said, okay, it's fine that we have this breakthrough of the year, but that was only possible because of decades of scientific research to understand the fundamental science. And so this, I think, it's an important thing that has to be mentioned over and over when we are debating science budgets. Unfortunately, the budgets, and particularly the science budgets, have become very partisan issues. It didn't used to be that way. For example, the doubling of the NIH budget that happened in the early 2000s was pretty much a bipartisan effort. The biggest increase ever for the NIH was during the stimulus. And of course, dozens of members of Congress, including myself, lost our seats in response to that, where there was this giant reaction against what was perceived to be out of control government spending. But because of that investment during the stimulus, you're seeing drugs that are coming up, coming into clinical trials and will soon be deployed, that are a direct result of that burst of funding that we put into the stimulus a decade ago.
I want to go to the audience in just a bit, but I want to ask you about the state of science leadership in the country, political leadership, not just in the Congress, but the White House. You've spoken out publicly about Mick Mulvaney not being one of your favorite people, who's now head of the Office of Management Budget. You've spoken out about President Trump. You just basically did. We had George Vredenberg here earlier talk about Roy Blunt and Tom Cole being real heroes in the Alzheimer's funding. But how does that terrain look in terms of science leadership, believers in science, and the political sphere? And what advice do you have for folks here that are very engaged in this question in terms of interacting with all of you?
Well, one thing is to pay careful attention both to the words and the votes.
Right.
The Congress is full of members who say how much they love science, and then they vote for things like the Ryan budget that represented roughly a 17% cut. Had it been enacted into law, it would have been a 17% cut for research budgets generally. And so you have to keep your eye on that, and you have to make sure the voting public is aware not only of their public pronouncements but their actual votes on these things. I think, however, when we were talking to members from either side of the aisle, it turns out that both Democrats and Republicans get cancer or Alzheimer's, and so they all have those stories.
Right.
My mother suffered from it. Her sister is suffering from it now. And because of that, you can connect with the individual stories. As a scientist, I find this a little bit frustrating because I'm all about statistics and stuff like that. But the power of anecdotes in politics is enormous, and we just have to recognize that. But also, when we have a tremendous breakthrough in whatever field, we have to be sure to connect that back to the decades of federally funded research that are responsible for it. We just had the Nobel Prize in Physics for the detection of gravitational waves, but that was a result of decades of very courageous federal investment in something that went from being completely insane to vaguely possible to, wow, this is going to work, to look at this. We're finding the collisions of black holes and measuring them.
And does Mick Mulvaney understand that?
Well, he was one of the people that was brought in. He was elected to Congress as a result of this reaction against, the stimulus and everything we did to rescue the economy. There's a large number of members of Congress who really believe that they were put there to erase government. And they have not taken the time to think and to educate themselves about the huge return on investment. And the fact that, if we could, find a low-cost cure for Alzheimer's or diabetes, it would be transformative to this very toxic debate that we're having about, what level of health care to provide to all citizens in the United States.
Fascinating. Let me open up to all of you. Questions, comments from the floor to our congressman here from Illinois. Yes, right in the front. Did you get paid a lot of money for discovering the quark?
No.
You got paid a government pay rate?
This was not the quark. This was the top quark.
The top quark, right.
The top quark, the heaviest known form of matter. It was discovered actually out at
I don't know why I mentioned it. I just wonder if government can still bring in geniuses at the pay levels that you got paid at. Is that a fair question?
Well, I don't know. It was an interesting, I often get asked why it was that I decided to leave my careers in business and science and get into this crazy business. And it's really, as much as anything, it was about my father, who was a scientist who left his career in science and became a civil rights lawyer, ended up writing a lot of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
I read that.
And so this is, it was actually reading his papers after he passed away that started me thinking about this question of what fraction of your life you spend in service to your fellow man, which is a question that actually science does not help you with at all.
but we're thankful you made that jump. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. So my name is Dr. Christopher Jansen. I'm a physician scientist, vascular neurologist here in town in Chicago. And I run a research lab that looks at the role of the meninges, sort of like the skin around the brain, and how that's involved in early stages of Alzheimer's and potentially in clearance of A-beta and toxic peptides. So my question to you is, the work that we do is expensive. Really to come up with disruptive technologies and new mechanisms, it takes a lot of time and effort over years.
Right.
And I'm wondering what more, speaking as both a scientist and a public policymaker, what more does government need to do to attract more young people, youngish people like me to the field and keep us in the fight over the long term? Because as you know, the NIH budget has faced challenges and funding levels are, maybe at the 20th percentile. So essentially 80% of potentially curative research is not being funded.
Yep. No, it's absolutely critical to have as stable and predictable funding as possible for science. It's really rough for a postdoc to not know whether or not there's going to be an uptick or a downturn, and frankly, what the level of tenured appointments is likely to be in the field they're thinking of going into. And so the chaos that's been injected into the science budgets in recent years, it doesn't do anyone any good when the Trump administration comes out proposing massive cuts. We have been so far very successful at fighting those off for the first couple budget cycles, but frankly, those had to do with very complicated negotiations. Right now the numbers look really good for science, but the reason for that, in large part, was that there was a negotiation having to do with the Dreamers and whether or not the Republican Party would do something about the Dreamers. It was only after they made it clear they were actually not interested in doing that, then we said, okay, if you want votes for this budget, you're going to have a lot better. If you're not going to do anything for the Dreamers, you have to do a lot more for things like the science budget and other democratic priorities. So what I'm saying is right now there is no guarantee that the good luck we've had in the last couple cycles will continue.
If you could, if I could follow, if you could be specific about what percentage of GDP would be sufficient. I wrote an article, an editorial.
I just got to end it.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, we'll come back after if we can. Just to quickly end, first I want to thank you, but just to end, we go to the West Coast a lot, and you hear about all of the technological breakthroughs we're on the edge of, and it just sounds like such a robust, amazing future. We talk about Washington. It sounds like the future is so fragile. Which should we pay more attention to?
Both. I think it's really important to have a higher level of technical competence in Congress at all levels, at the staff level and at the member level. And it's tough because of the 2-year cycle causes.
Right.
I often say that if you don't come into this business with attention deficit disorder, you rapidly develop it. So it's a challenge, but I think Alzheimer's is one area where I'm really optimistic that we're going to continue to have good results.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Foster, thank you so much.